Hey Drew, how you doing?
Hey, Josh, thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. Let me introduce us. I am Josh Summers. This is Meaning of Life TV, and you are Drew Ackerman. I've been thinking about how to introduce you best. Phrases that have come to mind is that you're the soporific saint, the bodhisattva of the bed zone. You're the man, the mind, the voice behind the podcast Sleep With Me, the podcast that puts me and thousands, if not millions of people to sleep on a night-to-night basis. So I'm really glad to have you here. Meaning of Life tends to be a pretty academic crowd, with philosophers, scientists, psychologists exploring the mysteries of life. But as many people know, if quality of sleep goes down or starts to tank, meaning in life can become quite difficult or quite hard. So I just wanted to have you on to talk about what you do, what your podcast is about, what your process is about, and how that could benefit anybody that may be having difficulty in the deep, dark night, as you describe it. So to begin, a little bit about your history. I know you've talked about this before, but how did you go from being an insomniac, or how long back did you have difficulties with sleep, and then how did that morph into this kind of performance therapy role you have with the podcast? Producing a podcast for insomniacs to help them sleep and get to bed.
Yeah, well, first off, thanks for calling me the Bodhisattva of Bed Zone. Now I'm going to be thinking of that Kenny Loggins sign, Highway to the Danger Zone. I'll be singing that version of it. But yeah, I guess like it comes from overthinking a lot of my lack of sleep. It all started way back when I was in grammar school in like fifth grade in particular. I was having a lot of trouble at school. I had undiagnosed insomnia and I was acting out, and the teachers saw me as kind of as a person that wasn't putting in enough effort. And at night I would just stay up worrying about school and trying to plan for what am I going to do the next day, or how can I predict how the teachers are going to act so I can plan how I'm going to behave. And it just was really hard. And I shared a room with my brother, but I always felt lonely. And even when my parents tried to help, they'd be like, "Oh, well, why are you staying up all night thinking about school? Think of something nice." And I would say, "Well, I can't stop. If I could do that, I would." Or, "Oh, imagine yourself descending a staircase." And I tried everything and I couldn't find anything that worked. And I couldn't stop thinking about school because I was kind of terrified. And like I said, I just felt really lonely and incredibly, I mean, looking back, it was a really painful time. But at the same time all that was going on, I discovered this radio show called the Dr. Demento Show. A classmate had told me about it, and his older brother listened to it. And it was on Sunday nights at 9 p.m. And it was like a comedy radio show with parody songs and stuff. And I would listen to that because Sunday nights were always the worst because I hadn't been at school for 2 days. And the radio show never put me to sleep, but it always helped me escape my thoughts and distracted me from thinking about school and made me laugh and made me feel okay. And I never forgot that kind of relief it gave me. So I had the balance of this pain and this relief, and I think it just sat latent in my mind for a long time. And then as I started to listen to podcasts, I was always like, how come there isn't a bedtime story podcast for grownups and all these options to help people fall asleep? There's not really something based in bedtime stories, particularly kind of silly ones. A lot of bedtime insomnia cures seem very serious and intense.
Well, are they more in the range of sort of guided meditation or guided relaxation or even hypnosis? Was that the stuff you were coming in contact with?
Yeah, like stuff like that, or stuff that was more passive, rain or jungle noises. And none of that helped me as an adult either. It was something I would pay attention to instead of distracting me, or something I felt like I was doing wrong, or that I should be following this meditation, or I would be overthinking about a guided meditation. Well, geez, what is my spirit animal? What does that say about me if I decide, well, should I pick a mammal or a lizard? So I don't know. I couldn't find anything. So I said, what if I could try to make this podcast? Would anybody listen to it? What would it be? And when I first had the idea, and for a long time, I have a huge internal critic, which was like, no, that's terrible. That's so embarrassing. You're going to tell bedtime stories to strangers, like publicly, and what's it going to be? And I kept shooting the idea down until I finally decided to give it a try.
Well, I have to say, even, I heard about you in the dog park where I get most of my good information. And one day, the guy said, have you heard of this podcast? This guy, he just talks and sort of tells you a story and puts you to sleep. And my initial feeling was that sounds creepy.
Yeah.
That sounds a little weird. Were there things? So it sounds like going back to fifth grade into your adulthood. That sounds like a long battle with insomnia. Did you find any solutions or half solutions along the way, or was it just a grim period?
Unfortunately, I found a solution that worked for the symptoms, which was like kind of self-medicating, and that helped me kind of sleep, but not really sleep. And that kind of became a crutch that I leaned on for a long time until I like moved on from that. But so for a lot of my 18 to into my 30s, like I was abusing alcohol to sleep, and that worked, but it didn't really work or allow me to flourish or actually fully live my life. So that was one thing that I relied on. And again, it was like maybe part of me was still always in search of a solution that didn't come with a lot of liabilities.
So in the podcast that you've created, you describe, in the structure of your podcast, you have this you have sponsorships up front where you sort of talk about how you support the podcast financially. But then you give a sort of an introduction to the podcast itself before you get into the bedtime story, which is sort of the body of the thing. And in the introduction, you sort of describe what you're going to be doing. I think it's an attempt to kind of create a safe space or a safe zone for people so they can feel comfortable and relaxed. But how do you, if you could give us a sense of that, how do you describe the podcast to people in terms of what you're doing?
Yeah, so I guess the podcast is kind of broken up into two major parts, like you're saying, like the intro and then the bedtime stories. And intro, which
I just had to interject and add, I don't usually get past the intro. I think I'm not alone. That if I do make it past the intro, I'm in trouble. It might not work that night.
Right. Yeah. And I guess that's been an interesting thing as I've been doing the podcast for a while, is finding out these different use cases of how different people use the podcast. And the intro kind of grew out of that. And then there's some people that skip the intro and go straight into the bedtime stories. But I always look at the intro as a kind of dedicated to two different groups. There's the regular listener that wants to be reminded, oh, this podcast is here for you to help you fall asleep. I'm trying to make it a safe place. And it's kind of this safe, silly place. And you kind of know what's coming, but you don't know. The intro's familiar, but it's different every time. So that's for the regular listener. And then I make the intros for the new listener who ideally is skeptical, who's tried out a lot of different stuff. And they're like, what is it? Wait, so there's a dude that tells bedtime stories? What is it? What? And so to kind of get them familiar with it, and almost in a self-selecting way, so they can say, oh, this definitely isn't for me. Or they can say, oh, I'm not sure what this is, so I'm going to keep listening and give it a few tries. So it's kind of non-intimidating. But yeah, I don't know. I've always found that for me, having variety with the podcast, whatever the mechanism is in people's brains that says, oh, I'm going to start bothering you again about the future, past, present, or future. If it's different every time, the listener can kind of settle back and kind of follow what I'm saying. But I do a lot of rambling and unresolved metaphors and twists and turns. So people know not to take it too seriously either, and that they can kind of let me kind of become background noise if they wish.
Yeah, and I mean, in the podcast, you often use that phrase. You have meanderings upon meanderings, tangents upon tangents. And also, not to discount this, your voice itself, the famous gold plaque, creaky, dulcet tones.
Yeah.
Right? This thing that has this soporific quality. I mean, because it strikes me what you're doing is you're taking, and you say this in the intro, I think at times, you're taking people's attention off whatever it might be that's keeping them awake. So, for some people it's rumination, some people it's physical sensation, pain, some people it's environmental. For me, that's actually the one that it comes up the most. Is if I travel for work, sleeping in strange beds just becomes this liability, and it's very hard for me to relax and settle into that. But and people often say to me like, oh, well, you're a meditation person. You should be able to relax, clear your mind and calm down and fall asleep. But it's actually, I think there's different functions of attention that are going on. Like being able to focus on something and sustain attention on something is different from being able to let go of having attention at all, in a certain sense, right?
Yes.
And this is where you're like the formula or recipe of your magic really comes in, because you're kind of interesting but not too interesting, boring but not too boring, funny but not too funny. And I guess I'm just curious.
This is what a lot of my dates say too. Like, but they don't know about the podcast.
But how do you? I mean, it seems like a fine line that you're walking in a way. And how do you think about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to process it for me, but like hearing what you're saying is like, I strongly believe that as human beings, we're kind of wired for narrative. At least a part of our brain is. And this is just on instinct. I don't have a background in this, but people have been telling bedtime stories since the dawn of communication. So, and that whether you're traveling or you're in chronic pain or you're going through a difficult spot in life, like there's a story that goes along with that. And it might be some part of your brain that's a little bit tricky, like that's telling you the story, and you don't even know it's a story because you're the main character, and you're also. One part of you is telling the story and one part of you is in the story, and the stakes they could be when you spilled milk on yourself in third grade, or it could be, what's going to happen in this relationship I'm in. And to remove yourself from that, even for you, like you're saying, it's like, it's just not a matter of like, ooh, I'm going to clear my mind now and just breathe a few times. It's like when you're telling a story and it's your life and your stakes, like it can feel very real. And so for me, part of the podcast is like offering an alternative story where the stakes are low and the person listening isn't involved at all. And they can say, this story is kind of a little bit preferable to what's going on in my head and it's outside of me. So maybe I could listen to that. And it just gives you a little bit of distance between those other stories that might be going on in your head. And it's just one theory I have of the podcast, but I try to frame it that way in my head when I'm saying it is like, okay, like here's another story you can listen to, that's just here to help. Like, and it's also optional to listen to it.
Yeah. And I mean, that's another theme that you speak about is that you say you don't necessarily put people to sleep. You're there to accompany them, and then they'll fall asleep on their own at some point if it's going to work. In terms of the types of stories that you do create, I mean, you've created now over 600 episodes.
Yes,
and you were cranking them out, I think, 3 times a week. Is that shifted down to twice a week now? Is that where you're at?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
But in terms of like sources for where you're getting these stories, I mean, I don't actually hear the stories that much. I see the titles, but I never catch the narrative. But your podcast is working and doing its charm. But I have seen titles around Game of Thrones, Star Trek episodes, Doctor Who episodes, trips to Trader Joe's. And I remember hearing one where you're just narrating, going down the aisles and looking at different types of nuts and cereal boxes, and So what is your process in terms of story creation like?
It's interesting, like talking about alignment, because a lot of it is like. The podcast has taught me to be more mindful in my own life and to just pay attention to the details I encounter every day and to what catches my attention and say, could I do an episode about that? Like if I see like a bird, a bird like in my yard and my dog keeps staring at it, it's like, okay, like, is there a story there? Like, oh, like this bird. And then I start to notice more details. Oh, like, well, look at the way the feathers are on that bird. And so a lot of the story is finding what catches my attention. And I think that's important because this is, this is like somewhat interesting, like, because a part of my brain is fixating on it. And then, or TV shows or fictional stories, and then kind of developing it from there. Because a lot of the production side or the creation side, it's hard to explain, but it's like, I see myself as like trying to be as present in the story as I can. And instead of like creating it or finding it in my imagination, it's like watching it unfold and kind of narrating it to the listener, or going to a memory of being grocery shopping and then following that memory in my mind and then narrating it. And because there's like all these layers to it, it actually helps me make the podcast, because it's like the memories are a little vague, and then I can see what kind of details I can see through the fog in my mind and kind of ramble about that. And then if it's not going anywhere, I'll say, okay, let me look around here. I call it the story swamp for me. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like I'm getting into this swamp and I'm like digging my hands underneath and picking up this muck and being like, what's this muck look like? What's here? And then kind of using that to kind of create these meanders. And ideally, it's like just windy enough that people can listen, but not totally pay attention. Or if it's a hardcore insomniac, there's a small percentage of listeners that are just hardcore insomniacs, and they're not going to fall asleep. And I always think about that too, that it's like, my job is to be here present with you and telling the story with these caveats of it being strange and meandering all the way to the end, to be your accompaniment in the deep dark night.
You know, the strange meandering piece is interesting to me from a cognitive perspective, because I've, in telling friends and family members about your podcast, I've tried to imitate a little bit. I can do your voice on the intro, some like friends and welcome, blah, blah, blah. But when I try to do the meandering, like I find I hit the gears the gears grind up pretty quickly, and I can't sustain that kind of bizarre, tangential, associative type of speech intentionally. And so that's the piece I'm curious about in the way you produce it, whether it's when you're recording them or even writing them. Or do you feel like you go into this sort of this altered state, and when associations come up, you're just following them and getting into the loop from there, like kind of like a jazz musician riffing on an idea, or what is it more like going on for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like, and I think there's a couple different answers. And I think it's like, it's interesting for me as a human being, because some of these things for the podcast, they don't necessarily always carry over to my regular life, which can be frustrating, because a lot of the podcasts, when I'm recording it, is about being present in the moment and like letting go of my critics. So the first thing is like trying to check my critic at the door of my climb-in closet where I record the show. And even sometimes I can get agitated while I'm recording it, and I have to pause sometimes and say, listen, we're just making a sleep podcast to help people fall asleep. This doesn't have to be the greatest story ever told. Let's just calm down. And so a lot of it is like being present, just like I was sitting there telling someone a story in person. And then the material wise, I guess it's like trust, like part of it is trusting, like that I can be in the moment and that things are going to unfold and that I can follow them as they unfold. And I mean, part of it is I've done it 600 times. So there is like a level of experience there, but there's also constantly being collecting things. So if I'm doing a TV show episode, I'll watch the TV show episode like 4 times and take extensive notes on like 2 watches. And so I'll have a lot of material there, so that, like you're saying, like I don't get I have something to go to. So if I start to feel the gears start to grind, I can say, okay, let's move our attention to what were the characters on Game of Thrones wearing, or how does the actor hold their body language, and just paying attention and taking a lot of notes. Or if it's a written story, just knowing where the story's going. A lot of times it's like, it's weird that most people are asleep for the story, but I try to make sure the stories have a beginning, middle, and end, and some sort of central conflict, even though it might not be a scary conflict, because then as a storyteller, I know where the story is going, and I can have a little relief in that and be like, oh, okay. Like, so it's a matter of managing like a lot of details, and a matter of knowing where it's going,
Mm-hmm.
and then of just trying to stay calm and also like take the pressure off. Like I'm trying to take the pressure off the listener, but it's for me, it's like, okay, we're not doing brain surgery here. We're just here to keep someone company. Just like that little kid that I was in 5th grade. Like, I don't think I wanted any answers of why I couldn't sleep. I just wanted someone to say, wow, you can't sleep. That must be terribly painful. Like, let me just sit here with you and keep you company. And I can't fix it, like, but I can be here with you to spend some time with you and try to relieve some of that.
And you mentioned the idea of taking the pressure off, and I think I saw somewhere in an article in Fast Company or the Washington Post that you did you extend the length of the podcast for that very reason? Like, it used to be a shorter podcast, and then you find people were a little bit pressured, like the feeling that they wouldn't be able to fall asleep in time, so that was keeping them awake. But stretching that to an hour made everyone feel like, okay, I got a whole hour with this thing, and I can nod off.
Yeah. Like, so when I first started the podcast, it was like, well, how often would people want this? And when I started it, I was like, well, if I was listening, I'd want it 5 nights a week, every work night. But then I was like, okay, that's not going to happen. So eventually I settled on 3 times a week. And then the same thing with the length and the intro. It was as I was making it, being like, would this work for me? Or taking listener feedback and being like, yeah, these episodes, like if they're 22 minutes, it gives people an anxiety that they have to be asleep in 22 minutes or the episode's going to end. In that there's so many shoulds around bedtime or mental health or even meditation. Sometimes it can creep in, like, and this takes the shoulds off. It's like, I'm going to be here about an hour. You can listen however you want to listen, but I'll be here till the end. And ideally, like, I'm not even here, like I said, to help you fall asleep. Or I don't see this as like a sleep solution. I always call it a sleep offering in some sense, because it's like, here's the story, and I'm offering it out there for you. And you can take it and use it as you want and see how it works. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But if it does, that's great. Like, instead of like, oh, this thing's gonna, you know what? For only $19.95, I guarantee this is gonna put you right to sleep, like every time.
Right.
Because people can see through that, and I think it just drives a certain percentage of people that can't sleep. It just drives what keeps them awake anyway.
Yeah, there is that caveat always in the beginning of your intro that this may not work. See how, and even for people that may want to try this after this conversation, you do always indicate too that it seems to work better 2 or 3 times in. You settle into the format of it, and it sort of has a better efficacy at that point.
Yeah, it is very different. And I mean, even for adults, it's like the idea of another adult, is particularly a stranger, telling you a bedtime story in your earbuds against your brain in the middle of the night when you're in bed is understandably, it takes a leap of faith to trust me. And I think the onus is on me to kind of earn that trust.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm glad people are skeptical.
Well, and something you just mentioned too is, a listener right now might think, okay, this is going to be a bit weird. I got my iPhone next to me. I got my earbuds in. That could be uncomfortable. That itself could be a deterrent to falling asleep because of the pressure. And I just want to give a little plug. This is for more of a product for fee. But I learned about it through your site that there is a gadget out there known as sleep phones, which is a stretchy headband with speakers in it that you can wear that doesn't have that pressure of something sticking into the ear.
Yeah, and if you're on a plane, you can pull them over your eyes too.
Well, that was going to be my endorsement. That sometimes I do red eyes to Europe, and I find them to be some of the most miserable things in economy class, cramped in there and not being able to sleep for 5 or 6 hours, and you're 2 for 2 right now.
All right.
Like, I've gone 2 nights, 2 flights over, knocked out for the most of the flight. And I queue up multiple episodes just to keep it going. But it's really handy. This might be a good time, if you're up for it, if you'd be willing to give listeners a sample of your magic.
Sure. Okay. So everybody just settle in and let's say usually how I start the podcast. So say, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls and friends beyond the binary, welcome to Sleep With Me, podcast to put you to sleep. We do it with a bedtime story. But today it's kind of daytime when I'm doing this story. I'm here with Josh, and we're doing a interview here on Skype, and I'm like, I don't know Josh that well, but he's listened to my podcast for a while. But then I'm like looking around the back of Josh's video, and I see like a plant, and I'm wondering like, is that a spider plant? And then I immediately, as a sleep podcast, wonder, well, should I change the name of the spider plant to another plant, like a long-leaved plant? I don't know what a long-leaf plant like that. And I think about like Christmas lights and how I've always wanted to put Christmas lights up at a different time of year than just this time of year. Like they make the room. They can. I don't know. There's something about sitting on your couch and looking at Christmas lights or holiday lights or sparkling lights, and you can find it relaxing. And maybe put on a little Beethoven in the background, and you can listen to that, and lie on the couch. There's something about lying on the couch at night, listening to music that can be incredibly relaxing, even if you're not going to sleep. And I was doing it recently. I was like, why don't I do this more often? Like just lie here on the couch and listen to some music and relax. So it's kind of a little sample of like where I would get, how I'd go. Then I'd probably say, wow, and then I'd go from there, like try to find a character and create something.
Ample evidence of the creaky dulcet tones, I have to say. So that was great. Thank you. Your podcast has been kind of, astronomically successful. Where are your stats these days? Are you still in the top 50 on iTunes?
I think it goes up and down. Like sometimes I think the iTunes charts are like based on new subscribers. So it kind of depends on like if like people are getting, like if people are spreading the word about the show, or I don't know, my show's very driven by habit. So like it's not all students that listen to the show, but when school's in session, like I think between students and parents, like my show tends to grow or do well during the school season. And then when people are off of school.
I saw that there was a documentary that just came out, a short little documentary that one of your fans had put together on you. And they included the fact that in last November of 2017, you had 4 million downloads.
Yeah. I mean, that's across all. We do have like 600 episodes, so it's across all episodes. Yeah. And that's an interesting use for the podcast. It's like people are listening to the new episodes, but there's listeners that are listening to the back catalog, or there's long-term listeners that only listen to 5 or 6 episodes, period. Like, so it's like medication in some weird way. It's like, oh, there's all these off-label uses that I wasn't expecting when I first started making it. But yeah, like in all honesty, like the podcast has been one of those things that has been like grown from slow and steady production. Like when I started the show and I first started putting out, I had no listeners. Like, and I would check the stats and be like, oh wait, no, that was me that downloaded it that one time. Like, and it's been so that as I've stuck with it, like, I've been lucky enough to encounter people like you that are willing to share about the show, or whoever was at the dog park. Thank you very much. Thank them if you see them.
His name's
and
John.
Say, hey, this John. Thanks, John. Like, John's dog or dogs. Like, but yeah, like that people have shared it and been willing to share it, and I don't know. It's really been a humbling experience, like knowing that I can help people that are in the same situation that I've been in. Or like an overnight flight, like just imagining being cramped in there. It's like, oh, that's nice that I was able to offer some relief. Yeah,
no, it's big. Did you notice any spike in subscriptions around November 8th, 2016, by any chance?
I don't know. I'd have to look back there. Is that the
we'll mention what we won't mention
day at the dog park?
Not the day at the dog park. No. They have an election, but.
Oh, no. Yeah. So the election did impact the podcast more on listeners reaching out to me. Like, I mean, I think we just live in a time that people are way more reactionary wherever they're coming from. And I think like it's been a lot harder to sleep, like for a lot of people. And yeah, so after the election, I did hear in November. I got a lot. I've been getting a lot more emails since then, like with people wanted to share their stories of why they can't sleep.
And how long has the podcast been going? Is it 4 years now? 5 years?
Yeah, so it started in October, November 2013.
Okay. And you had a day gig at that time, right?
Yeah, I've worked a day job until like I left my day job in November,
This last year.
like just left. Yeah, to try to see. It just became so much work trying to where I was making my life unmanageable. But yeah.
Well, that's actually one of the questions I wanted to back up on was just in terms of production. Do you have an estimate on how much time you put into one episode?
I mean, depending on the episode, I think it takes about 20 hours to produce an episode, like with editing. Now, I do have editors that do the editing, so that takes a few hours, but there's a lot of prep work and the recording. And then I don't think it is I'm not a perfectionist. I just want the episodes to be as good as possible when they come out. So I'll re-listen to the episodes a few times. And then, as you know, there's a lot of background stuff with video or audio of exporting it and converting it and all that kind of stuff on the back end. But yeah, I think I do see myself sometimes as Don Quixote. It's am I putting all this work in? I don't care that people don't hear it, but more sometimes people will say, well, why don't you just read out of the phone book or something? And whether it is a Don Quixote belief, I believe that the variety and the quality is what makes a podcast work. And that could be a delusion, but if it's a delusion that's working for everybody, I guess it's one I'm willing to embrace, I guess, in some sense.
Well, no, that comes back to the kind of the boring novelty of it, in the sense that you really are bringing someone's attention to something that it is almost impossible to hold on to. I think that's the magic sauce here, is that you're taking them off what's keeping them awake, but then it's this slippery narrative that just the mind can't hook into it, because it didn't really come across in your sample, but it just becomes nonsensical. And that's another strange part of it, that I've woken up in the middle of your stories, and sort of been like, what the hell is he talking about? It's just this, it's gibberish and very, very odd. So you've amassed a pretty significant community too. You have a Facebook group with somewhat almost like a cult-like following of people who are really reliant and extremely grateful. I mean, the threads and the reviews I see on iTunes, I mean, people are really, really supportive and appreciative. One question on that group, when I posted them to them saying I was going to be interviewing, was they wanted to know if you felt their appreciation, if you or were aware of the significance of what your work is.
Yeah, I mean, it emotionally has a huge impact on me, knowing that there's all these people out there that are suffering in different ways and that I can help. And then knowing how there is this alternative world out there, of people full of gratitude, that are willing to say thank you and share their stories with me. It's just been so wonderful. And I've been able to interact with all these people and hear why they can't sleep. And so often it's just them saying, hey, thank you. This is what I've been through and this is why I can't sleep. And I just wanted to let you know that I really appreciate the work you put into the show, because it helps. And to me, that it's fuel to keep the podcast going. And it's also this salve or this balm in the face of news sometimes, to be you know what, this is one narrative that's being told, but there is this other, the world is full of grateful, nice people. And I think in some countercultural way, that's something we need to foster. It's important.
Right, and that's why I gave you the moniker of Bodhisattva of the bed zone. Is there any dynamic with your listeners that influences how you shape the podcast? Have you evolved the podcast in response to things you've heard, or?
Yeah, I'm always listening, and kind of processing what I'm hearing, whether it's in the Facebook group or in emails or whatever, and trying to trying to give myself space, I guess, to let my subconscious figure it out. Like, so if someone says, oh, this bothered me, or oh, this stuck out to me, or oh, this woke me up, like early on when I would hear it, I'd say, okay, let me test this out in the show. And now I'll say, okay, let me listen and listen to that. Or if someone hears something in the show that might be objectionable to them, even if it's something small or something that they're struggling with, like I think a few months ago, someone was mentioning that I was like talking about money a lot. So then I can re-listen and say, oh, okay, okay, is there a way in the future I can craft the narrative or just be aware of that, or come up with a nickname for money if it's in the middle of the podcast, so it's not like a word that the person's like, oh, wait, he just said money, I can't stop thinking about it. Like, so it is a matter of like listening and then processing it, because otherwise my critic will just fixate on it and say, oh, this is the reason you're just bad at podcasting, or oh, this is like the sign of doom that you need to buy. It's like, okay, like, let me listen to any feedback or criticism. And there's like, sometimes like we do live in a world with like bullies and people that are lashing out. So sometimes people lash out. But for me, I'm like, okay, like if someone needs to lash out at me, maybe they just needed to get that off their chest and not going to honk at somebody 2 hours from now or something like that.
So you've graduated in a sense. You're no longer working at the library?
Yes, yeah.
So
yeah.
Has this freed up your life more? And what's to come now? Do you have any plans in mind or changes that you're going to instigate?
Yeah, I mean, like it has freed up a little bit of my time. Like I'm still like involved where I used to work. Like I'm trying to teach podcasting there, like for free. But I think like I'm working on a live version of the podcast. Like I think that would be fun in some sense, and like allow me to connect with listeners in even more way, and kind of so they can see what it's like watching the story unfold or watching me make the stories, and kind of encourage people to tell bedtime stories in their own lives. And I don't know how successful that will be, but it's like something I'm curious about.
What would a live podcast look like?
I'm not like, I've tested out like something like where it's more didactic, like being like, oh, let me teach you like how to tell a bedtime story, and then giving examples from the podcast. And then I've also just tested out doing like segments, like 20-30 minute segments from the podcast. Mm-hmm. And it seems like listeners would prefer this, just like the segments, like but I'm always overthinking stuff. Like I said to them, like, well, what about people that don't listen to the podcast? What about these like so it's kind of a matter of, again, just like when I started the podcast, I was saying, okay, Drew, like, let's just see how this goes and test it out, and like keep developing it and fine tuning it, and trying to incrementally make it a little bit better. But yeah, I'm not sure. Like, I guess like it's terrifying to me in some sense, but also fun and freeing to be like, oh, what would a live sleep with me be, and what's going to work best, and what's going to be fun for people that would come to it.
All innuendo aside, too, we should just say. A live sleep with me can sound...
You sleep with me live with a big exclamation point, like question mark or half, maybe.
Right. Maybe one of my last question is not totally relevant to the podcast, but a little bit, is that has anyone reported to you that they found their own ability to speak clearly and be articulate, that it's been compromised as a result of listening to your meanderings?
I don't know, like probably. I always worry when I meet someone or do like an interview like this, like I always like get worried that it's like that it's going to ruin the podcast for the person. Like they'll be like, oh, wait a second, I've seen Drew and like how he's kind of like a little bit different than Scooter. And then I'm like, oh, mate, did I just ruin the podcast for that person? But it's always worth. I guess it's always worth the risk.
No, I'm not worried about that. I've actually been a little worried about my own, because I teach yoga and meditation, and I've noticed at times if I'm really immersed in a stretch of listening to the podcast, that sometimes my speech, which tends to be somewhat incoherent already, is even further compromised. And I kind of ramble and mumble a little bit, and sort of come up with new words on the spot too, like neologisms, like you do. So I was just wondering about that. I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on the show. One thing that is patently evident to me, both in talking to you now and in listening to the podcast as much as I have, is that you really do exude a strong care for people. And I think that's probably one of the things that has ignited your community to the extent that it has, that it's very palpable how much you care and want people to get a good night's sleep. And it's just, that alone is a very touching testament of your work.
Thank you. Yeah. Someone once pointed out the idea of this wounded healer archetype, and I can totally go with that. It's like, I've been there in the deep dark night and desperate, and like I made mistakes, like to escape from my insomnia, and like, so I know how it feels, and I might not know what it feels like to be a soldier with PTSD or someone with chronic pain, but I can relate to that, and that's really helped me kind of grasp a little bit better empathy and compassion. And the podcast, like, despite it being like people listening to it and me being able to help people fall asleep and all this great stuff, like, it's really helped me grow as a person. And like, whether, if anybody, I guess it was the interactions with the listeners that kind of spurred that, but like, it's like, if nothing else ever came from the podcast, it's like fundamentally changed how I live my life and kind of forced me to view the world in this more optimistic lens than in a cynical lens, in a critical lens like I have in the past. Like, so it's really opened me up. And I think, like, any risk, like whether it's, doing interviews like you're doing, or testing out writing a book, or just doing blog articles, or just talking to people, a stranger at a dog park, it's like taking those risks really has these intangible rewards that give meaning to life. I mean, it really, like, the podcast has changed my life for sure.
Well, I know I speak for many of your folks in the community, but we thank you for your risk. And in your own words, maybe we should let you get back to the show. That's actually one of my favorite lines of your intro, is like, you've gone through this rambling introduction and you say, now let's get on with the show. Like, it's this big, exciting, dramatic thing that's going to just bore you and put you to sleep.
It's like, that's for watching too much cartoons as a kid, like those things. Like, I watched so much cartoons that it's like embedded in my brain somewhere.
That's great. All right. Well, thank you, Drew. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks so much, Josh. Have a great day.
Sorry, one more thing. If people want to find you, we'll have links in the show notes and all that, but it's sleepwithmepodcast.com.
Yeah, sleepwithmepodcast.com, or if you have a podcast app on your phone, you could just search Sleep With Me and subscribe, and then you get the episodes delivered straight to you.
Yeah. Get the goods.
Yeah. Get the good dull stuff. Straight into your brain.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again.
All right. Thank you.
Talk to you.